They called her the light of the future. But on a cold November night in 1817, that light flickered and died, and the silence that followed would change the British monarchy forever. Here's the part they never told you. When the doctors burst into the royal bedchamber, the air was thick with candle smoke, chloroform, and the smell of panic. Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, the woman destined to be queen, lay still, her skin drained of all colour. Her husband knelt beside her, holding her lifeless hand, whispering her name into the void. And somewhere outside, church bells began to toll before the news was even official, as if the world itself already knew a terrible secret. This wasn't just a royal tragedy. It was an event so seismic it rewrote the line of succession, pulled England into an era of mourning, and indirectly gave birth to a queen who would rule for the next 63 years, Victoria. But the real story, the whispers behind the walls, the secret letters, the silent cover-ups, those have been buried under centuries of royal decorum. And tonight, you're going to hear what truly happened when the heir to the British throne died in her prime, and the kingdom trembled like never before. London, 1816. The city was restless. The wars were over, Napoleon was gone, and for the first time in years, the streets didn't echo with the marching of troops, but with the murmurs of a new kind of hope. And at the centre of that hope was a young woman barely 20 years old, Charlotte, Augusta of Wales. She was everything her father was not. Where the Prince Regent, soon to be George IV, was arrogant, extravagant, and despised, Charlotte was warm, spontaneous, and adored by the people. She was, quite simply, the future everyone wanted. From the moment she was born, her life was a battlefield of politics and emotion. Her parents loathed each other. Her mother, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, was German, eccentric, and utterly unsuited to the rigid British court. Her father called her ugly and clumsy. Within weeks of the marriage, they separated, and little Charlotte became the pawn in a cruel game between them. She grew up torn between two worlds, the opulence of the palace and the loneliness of isolation. Tutors came and went, friends were forbidden, and every letter she wrote was inspected. The court watched her like a hawk, afraid that one misstep might make her too much like her mother, too wild, too human. But Charlotte had her mother's fire. When her father demanded she marry a dull, humorless prince from the Netherlands, a political arrangement designed to secure alliances, she refused. She ran away, literally escaping through the back garden of her residence, weeping and defiant. The newspapers loved it. For once, the British people saw a royal who acted like them, who fought for love instead of duty, and love she found. Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the name meant little at first. He was a soldier, quiet, almost solemn, but beneath his restraint burned a loyalty that few men possessed. When they met, Charlotte saw something in him the court never expected, a partner who would treat her not as a princess to be managed, but as a woman to be cherished. Their wedding, in May 1816, was small by royal standards, but electric in emotion. As they exchanged vows, people cheered outside St. James's Palace, as if England itself had been reborn. Newspapers called it the marriage of hearts. Poets wrote that the nation's daughter had found her perfect match. Yet behind those golden curtains, shadows began to gather. Charlotte's father, though forced to tolerate the match, never forgave her defiance. The court ladies whispered that Leopold's calm demeanour hid ambition. The old king, her grandfather, George III, was already descending into madness, leaving the family fractured and paranoid. And in that atmosphere of fragile hope, Charlotte's health began to fail. By the autumn of 1817, she was pregnant. The entire nation rejoiced. At last, one paper declared, "Our future is secured." The bells of St. Paul's rang. Church sermons praised divine providence. Women wept in the streets, imagining the next generation of stability after decades of chaos. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. Charlotte grew pale, her appetite vanished, and her doctorsmen, more accustomed to treating gout than childbirth, insisted she needed nothing but patience. Her midwife, Mrs. Bailey, begged to intervene, warning of complications. The court ignored her. The autumn storms began early that year, and as November drew near, the clouds above Claremont House seemed to mirror the anxiety inside it. The night of November 5th began like any other. The fire burned low. The clock ticked softly. But then came the cry. Charlotte's labor had begun. The ordeal lasted 50 hours. 50 hours of agony, of doctors whispering in corners, of Leopold pacing the halls until his knees gave way. When at last the child was delivered a boy, the future King He was stillborn. Charlotte never recovered by the next dawn. She was gone. England awoke to a silence so profound it felt unnatural. Shops closed. Bells tolled. People wore black armbands for months. It was said that even the roughest men in London wept openly in the streets. The kingdom had lost its future, and with it, its innocence, but few knew what really happened inside that room. How long her screams were ignored. How the doctors argued over her treatment. How the royal household, terrified of scandal, kept the public from learning the truth, and fewer still knew that one letter, written by Leopold's trembling hand, that morning would change the course of British history forever. When dawn crept over Claremont House, the mist outside was thick enough to swallow sound. The air had that strange, trembling stillness that comes only after great loss, as if the world itself was trying to breathe again. Inside, the candles had burned down to nubs. The scent of wax, lavender, and despair mingled in the cold air. Leopold sat motionless beside Charlotte's bed. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing. The doctors hovered near the door, whispering in half-sentences, their faces ashen. One of them, Sir Richard Croft, clutched his gloves so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had been the one in charge, the one who'd said no bleeding, no interference, nature must take her course. And now, as the young princess lay lifeless, he looked like a man haunted by a decision he could never undo. Outside, a servant slipped quietly through the corridors, carrying a folded letter sealed in black wax. It was addressed to Carlton House, to the Prince Regent. Inside, in Leopold's own hand, were the words no father ever wants to read. My angel is gone. By the time the message reached London, the news had already outrun it. The bells of St. Paul's had begun to toll before the royal messengers even arrived. Newspapers printed inky borders around her name. Shopkeepers draped their windows in black. And people who had never seen Charlotte, who only knew her as the laughing face in painted portraits, wept openly in the streets. She had been their hope, their link to a better, gentler monarchy after years of scandal. And now she was gone. In the royal residences, the reaction was not grief alone, but shock and fear. The Prince Regent collapsed when he heard screaming that he was undone. The court scrambled to compose official statements, trying to sound composed while hiding panic. For in the space of one night, the entire line of succession had shifted into uncertainty. Charlotte had been the only legitimate grandchild of George III. With her gone, there was no next generation. The king's sons, dissolute, aging and childless, had wasted their youth in affairs and gambling. Now, suddenly, the crown faced a crisis, and yet, in the middle of all that chaos, there was Leopold, a man whose world had been built around one woman. Now standing amid ruins, he refused to leave her side that morning. Servants begged him to rest. The doctors pleaded. He said nothing. He only reached out, took her cold hand, and whispered in German, "Mein Herz ich folge, dear bold. My heart, I will follow you soon." They buried her at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The coffin, lined in pale satin, carried both Charlotte and her stillborn son, mother and child, together. The sight broke even the hardest hearts. The hearse, drawn by 8 black horses, passed through streets filled with silent crowds. No cheers, no chants, no wails, only silence so deep that even the clatter of the wheels seemed sacrilegious. At Windsor, the sky turned grey and rain fell as if on cue. Leopold followed the coffin on foot, his uniform soaked through, face expressionless. Behind him, the royal family trailed a tableau of guilt, grief, and fear. In the days that followed, the kingdom sank into mourning. Black crape hung from doorways. Women wore black ribbons for months. In taverns and drawing rooms, people whispered that England had lost its Queen of Hearts. But behind those curtains of sorrow, darker conversations began, whispers of negligence, of arrogance, of the fatal mistake of trusting Sir Richard Croft. Some claimed he had bled her too late. Others said he had refused to act when she showed signs of distress. There were rumours of his breakdown, of how he would wander the halls at night muttering her name. 3 months later, during another difficult childbirth case, Croft took his own life. He left a note that said only, "I have failed, my queen." The tragedy became known in whispers as the triple obstetric tragedy, the mother, the child, and the doctor, all claimed by one fatal chain of events. But for Leopold, grief was not an episode, it was a permanent state. He returned to Claremont House and lived like a ghost. Servants said he kept Charlotte's rooms untouched, her dresses still hanging as she had left them, her handwriting preserved in glass cases. Every evening he would walk through the gardens they had once strolled together, stopping by the small lake where she liked to feed the swans. Years passed, but he never truly left that night. Letters he wrote during that time reveal a man half alive. "I cannot reconcile myself," he wrote to a friend. "The light of my life has been extinguished. I live in shadow." And yet, the story of Charlotte's death did not end with her, because while the kingdom mourned, the royal brothers, suddenly aware of their dynastic peril, began to panic. Each one rushed to marry and produce an heir. What had been unthinkable weeks before now became urgent duty. One of them, Edward, Duke of Kent, was the 4th son, quiet, reliable, largely overlooked. He had no ambitions for the throne. But under pressure, he agreed to marry a German princess named Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Yes, the same. Coburg family as Leopold, Charlotte's widower became the brother-in-law of the Duke's new bride. And when Edward's daughter was born 2 years later, they named her after her mother. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, and when fate took her uncles one by one, when the old line died out, that little girl, Charlotte's cousin, became Queen Victoria. Charlotte's death had not just broken hearts, it had rewritten destiny. But here's the cruelest twist of all. Had Charlotte lived, Victoria might never have been born, and the empire that defined an age, the Victorian era, might never have existed. The grief of one nation became the seed of another queen's reign. Still, for those who had loved Charlotte, no historical irony could console them. For them, the wound remained open. Every November, Leopold would order fresh flowers for her grave white roses, her favorite, and place them himself, no matter the weather. The world saw him later as a prince, a statesman, even a king in Belgium. But behind every title was the memory of one woman who had been his everything, and in the echo of her absence, the kingdom itself learned how fragile its future could be. The bells had long fallen silent, but the echoes of Charlotte's death lingered like a curse. London had returned to its grey rhythm, horses clattering on cobblestones, markets shouting prices, carriages splashing through puddles. Yet under it all was a lingering melancholy. Every glance toward Claremont or Windsor carried a shadow of what might have been, for the court, though mourning could not last forever. The kingdom faced an uncomfortable truth. There was no heir. King George III, once the firm patriarch of the realm, was now blind and mad, locked away at Windsor Castle, his mind lost to the fog of insanity. His sons, the infamous princes of pleasure, had squandered their youth on mistresses, gambling, and brandy. Not one had a legitimate child. Charlotte's death had exposed the royal family's greatest failure, not political, but personal. They had built no future. At Carlton House, the Prince Regent sat before the fire, his silk dressing gown stained with port, his face bloated from years of indulgence. He had aged decades in months. In private, he was inconsolable, muttering that God had punished him through his daughter. But grief soon gave way to calculation. The monarchy had to endure, and that meant heirs. Legitimate heirs. So began the most desperate marriage scramble in British history across Europe. Letters flew like cannon fire. Envoys sought princesses. Negotiations opened. Dowries debated. Within months, the royal brothers, each in their 40s or 50s, were engaged to women half their age. The press mocked them as the matrimonial campaigners, but behind the satire lay national urgency. Without a next generation, the Hanoverian line could end. Among these brothers was Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son. He was the quiet one, known for discipline rather than decadence, more soldier than courtier. He'd spent years abroad, largely forgotten by the gossip columns. But now, suddenly, he was relevant. Leopold's Coburg relatives saw an opening. They had lost Charlotte, but they could still bind their family to the British crown. And so it was that Edward met Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a widow, intelligent, practical, and of impeccable lineage. The match was arranged swiftly. Within a year of Charlotte's death, the wedding took place. There were no grand parades, no cheering crowds. It was a quiet affair, overshadowed by the ghost of the princess who should have been queen. But history, as always, moves in shadows. In the spring of 1819, Victoria gave birth to a daughter. The infant was small, dark-eyed, and strong-voiced. They named her Alexandrina Victoria after her godfather, Tsar Alexander of Russia, and her mother. Few noticed then. The girl was fifth in line, behind four aging uncles, who all seemed destined to produce sons. But the line of succession, like the course of history, has a way of surprising even kings. While the royal houses scrambled to rebuild their legacy, Leopold withdrew from public life. He had refused the regent's offer of wealth and titles. Instead, he lived in quiet exile at Clermont, surrounded by portraits and letters. But though the world saw him as a tragic widower, Leopold was far from idle. Behind closed doors, he became the silent architect of a new political web, one that would bind Britain and Europe for decades. He wrote constantly to his Coburg relatives, advising, strategizing, and guiding. His letters were meticulous, filled with insight and restraint. "Let our family remain united," he told his brother Ernest. "Through wisdom, not war, we may yet shape the destinies of nations." That destiny, though, was not yet clear in 1820. George III died, and the Prince Regent became King George IV. London erupted in celebration, fireworks, parades, cannon salutes, but the mood soured quickly. George was hated by the people, mocked for his vanity, despised for his treatment of his estranged wife, Caroline. The nation that had adored Charlotte now spat at the mention of her father. Caroline's attempt to attend her husband's coronation ended in humiliation. She was barred from Westminster Abbey. Within weeks, she fell ill and died. The people saw it as poetic justice, one more tragedy in a cursed dynasty. Leopold, ever the observer, watched from the sidelines. To him, it was proof that the British monarchy was drifting without purpose. The people had loved Charlotte not because she was royal, but because she was human. She had laughed too loudly, loved too freely, and lived too sincerely. In her, they had seen themselves. And so, in his private reflections, Leopold resolved that if another Coburg ever reached the British throne, she would not repeat the mistakes of the old kings. She would rule with heart, with conscience, with connection. He didn't know it yet, but he was writing the blueprint for Victoria when Edward, Duke of Kent, died suddenly in 1820. Mere months after his father, the infant Victoria became the heir presumptive. She was barely 8 months old. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, now found herself isolated in England, surrounded by suspicion and politics she barely understood. So she turned to the one man she could trust, Leopold, and so the widower of Charlotte became the unofficial guardian of the next queen. From afar, he guided every detail of Victoria's upbringing. Her tutors, her education, even her daily schedule bore his influence. Letters between them reveal the tenderness of a surrogate father and the strategic mind of a statesman. He warned against arrogance, encouraged humility, and taught her the art of patience, the same patience that had failed Charlotte. "Remember, my child," he wrote, "the crown is not a gift, but a burden. Carry it with grace, not pride." By the late 1820s, Leopold's life had transformed. Though he still mourned Charlotte, his grief had become a mission. He began advising European leaders, serving as a quiet diplomat between the great powers. His reputation for integrity spread, and in 1831, fate offered him a new role. The Belgian Congress invited him to become the first king of Belgium. It was an extraordinary twist. The man who had lost England's future became the architect of another nation's beginning. When Leopold accepted the throne, he wrote one last letter to Victoria. "My dearest child, I go to another country to serve a new people, but my heart will always be in England, and part of it forever in Clermont." He carried with him a small portrait of Charlotte, worn and faded, framed in silver. It remained on his desk for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, in England, the little girl he had once cradled was growing into a woman. She was curious, clever, stubborn, traits that reminded everyone of Charlotte. And when, in 1837, news came that King William IV had died, and that the crown had passed to the 18-year-old Victoria, the circle closed. The crowd outside Kensington Palace roared with joy. They didn't know it, but in that moment, the spirit of Charlotte, the heir who had died, lived again, for Victoria carried within her the dreams her cousin had left unfinished, and somewhere in Belgium, an aging king stood by the window of his palace, tears in his eyes, whispering a name he had not spoken aloud in years: Charlotte. The coronation of Queen Victoria in the summer of 1838 was, on the surface, a triumph of renewal. London pulsed with life as crowds flooded every street, their cheers echoing off the stone facades of Westminster and reverberating across the river to Suffolk. It was as if the city had been waiting for this moment, the rebirth of a dynasty once thought cursed. The banners that hung from every window fluttered in the June wind like the turning pages of a new chapter. Yet among the glittering jewels, the white horses, and the thunderous anthem that rose inside Westminster Abbey, there was something else in the air, a ghostly presence, unseen but deeply felt. For behind Victoria's crown, behind her steady youthful gaze, there lingered the memory of the woman who should have been standing there before her. Charlotte's name was never spoken that day, but her absence filled the silence between the organ's notes. Victoria herself had grown up surrounded by whispers of that loss, though no one dared speak it directly. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, had told her fragments enough to understand that her cousin Charlotte had once been beloved, radiant, the hope of a nation, and that her death had cast a shadow across England so deep that even her birth had been seen as consolation. "You were the gift heaven sent after tragedy," her governess once told her. And though the words were kind, they carried the weight of expectation. In every portrait gallery, Victoria saw Charlotte's likeness, a girl with soft eyes, a lively expression, and a confidence that felt strangely familiar. Sometimes she would stare at those portraits for long minutes, tracing the painted curls and wondering whether fate had merely borrowed her cousin's story and written it anew in her own name. In her private journals, Victoria mentioned Charlotte only twice, but the entries were telling. "How strange," she wrote at 17, "that all the hopes of England once rested upon another, and now upon me. I must not fail." She never forgot that her place on the throne was not destiny alone, but accident, born from loss, secured by tragedy, and shadowed by a girl who had died long before she could reign. Across the Channel in Belgium, Leopold followed every stage of Victoria's ascent with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He had guided her education, advised her mother, even chosen her tutors. He called her "my dear child," but in private. He confessed to his advisers that it was sometimes unbearable to see history repeat itself through another's eyes. When news reached him of her coronation, he stood in silence for a long while by the window of Buckingham Palace, his reflection half swallowed by the rain-streaked glass. Those who served him recalled that he wept quietly, not for himself, but for the life that had slipped away. To them, he seemed like a man torn between two worlds, one of duty and one of memory. Victoria's early reign bore his influence in ways subtle yet profound. The restraint of her speech, the dignity of her manner, even her choice of confidants, all bore traces of Leopold's invisible hand. He wrote to her often, his letters filled with paternal counsel. "The crown," he told her, "is not an ornament, but a responsibility. It must sit lightly upon your head, but heavily upon your conscience." Those words became her creed. The public saw her as an emblem of purity, a young woman who had restored the moral compass of the monarchy. What they did not see was how carefully that image had been shaped, not by the cold machinery of politics, but by a man still haunted by a promise made to a woman buried beneath Windsor's soil. But the ghost of Charlotte was not content to linger only in memory. She became a mirror through which the public viewed Victoria. In the first years of her reign, newspapers drew constant comparisons between the two cousins. Pamphlets called Victoria the second Charlotte. Poems spoke of England's reborn Rose, and artists painted her in scenes reminiscent of Charlotte's portraits, a deliberate echo, a comforting illusion that history had corrected itself. Yet for Victoria, those echoes were both blessing and curse. Every praise carried an unspoken warning: do not fall as she did. Every celebration hummed with the fear of repetition. When she married Prince Albert in 1840, the resemblance grew almost uncanny. Albert was German, dignified, moral, and unflinchingly devoted, much like Leopold had been. The public adored their union. At last, wrote the Times, the fairy tale continues. But beneath the surface, Victoria wrestled with invisible comparisons. Leopold had arranged the match himself, guiding the correspondence between her and Albert with the precision of a chess master. He saw in Albert not merely a husband for his niece, but a chance to fulfill, through another marriage, the dream he had once shared with Charlotte, a union of love and purpose. When the ceremony took place at St. James's Palace, Leopold attended as guest and mentor. He watched as Victoria, radiant in her white satin gown, walked down the aisle, and for an instant, memory blurred with reality. He saw not the young Queen of England, but Charlotte, laughing, vibrant, alive again in a moment borrowed from eternity. The sight broke him. He smiled through the ceremony, gracious and calm, but those near him noticed his hand trembled. Later that night, in his diary, he wrote, "I have lived to see happiness restored where once there was only sorrow. God is merciful. The years that followed were ones of empire and expansion, of railways, factories, and colonies, but in the quiet hours of the palace, Victoria remained a woman deeply aware of her cousin's shadow. She often asked her ladies to read to her the letters Leopold had once exchanged with Charlotte, preserved in faded ink and sealed in wax. The words spoke of affection, of hope, of the simplicity of two souls caught in a storm of politics. Sometimes she wept reading them. How young they were, she whispered once, and how cruelly denied. It was said that she kept one miniature portrait of Charlotte near her writing desk, hidden inside a drawer, as if to remind herself of the fragile line between fate and fortune. Leopold, now an aging monarch himself, continued to write her. Their correspondence became a thread of continuity between two worlds, his filled with memory, hers with responsibility. He counseled her on diplomacy, on faith, on the loneliness of leadership. Power isolates, he warned. Never let it silence your humanity. And she, in turn, thanked him, calling him my dearest uncle, my truest guide. But as time passed, their letters grew tinged with melancholy. When Albert fell ill in the early 1860s, Leopold sensed history stirring again. Cruel and cyclical. When news of Albert's death reached Belgium in 1861, Leopold was nearly 70. He dismissed his attendants and sat alone for hours, the letter trembling in his hand. Again, he murmured, again the light goes out. The echo of Charlotte's death returned with unbearable clarity. The young wife, the broken husband, the silent halls. It was as if fate had replayed his own tragedy through the life of the very woman he had guided from childhood. He wrote to Victoria that night, though his handwriting was barely legible. "You are not alone, my child. Grief is a kingdom of its own, and I have walked its halls before." Victoria never forgot those words. For the next 40 years, she lived as both monarch and mourner, building an empire while carrying the invisible lineage of sorrow that began with Charlotte. In public, she became the figure of indomitable strength, the widow of Windsor, the Empress of India, but in her private moments, she returned again and again to the story of the cousin who had died before her time. She was the dawn, Victoria wrote once in her journal, and I am only the day that followed, in the twilight of his life. Leopold often sat by the gardens of Lacan, staring across the lake where swans glided in the soft Belgian sun. Visitors who came to see him found a man serene, almost gentle in his solitude. But when he spoke of England, of Claremont, his voice would soften and falter. "Do you know," he said once to an aide, "there are some loves so great they shape nations after they are gone." The aide thought he spoke of Victoria. He did not. He spoke of Charlotte. It is said that in the final years of his reign, Leopold kept a single candle burning each night beside Charlotte's portrait. The wax would pool and harden by morning, only to be replaced by a new flame the next evening. When asked why, he smiled faintly and said, "So she may never wake to darkness." Charlotte of Wales, the heir who died, had become more than memory. She had become myth, woven into the bloodline of empire, a silent architect of an age she never lived to see. And though history remembers her as a tragedy, those who truly knew her story understood the deeper truth, that from her death came renewal, that from her silence came 1,000 voices, and that even the mightiest of empires is sometimes born from a single broken heart. Palace stood bare and skeletal against a sky of lead, their branches trembling in the cold wind that swept in from the north. Inside, the halls were dimly lit, their silence broken only by the echo of distant footsteps and the occasional crackle of firewood. King Leopold sat near the window of his private chamber, wrapped in a heavy cloak of black wool. Age had thinned him, hollowed the sharpness of his once youthful face, and silvered the hair that had once shone golden in candlelight. Yet even now there was a stillness in him, a dignity that spoke of something unbroken, the kind of calm born not from ease but from long endurance. On the table before him lay 3 objects: a silver cross, a letter written in a woman's hand, and a small portrait painted half a century ago. The face in the portrait was as vivid as ever, Charlotte's face, framed in soft curls. Her expression, caught forever between laughter and longing. He had carried that portrait through every chapter of his life, from the silent rooms of Claremont to the throne room of Brussels. When Belgium had crowned him its first king, he had placed the portrait in the royal apartments before any other symbol of power. When foreign ambassadors arrived with treaties, when generals presented their victories, the small painting was always there, quietly observing from its gilded frame. "She is the witness of my life," he had once told a friend. "Where others see a relic, I see a promise." Now, as the firelight flickered over the familiar features, the old king's hand trembled as he reached for it. His eyes, dimmed but still piercing, softened with the kind of grief that no years could erode. "It has been so long," he whispered in German, his voice barely more than breath. "And yet I remember the sound of your laughter as if it were yesterday." Outside, the bells of Brussels tolled the evening hour, and the city settled into its winter hush. The people loved their king, the quiet, deliberate monarch who had given their young nation stability and respect. They knew him as wise, thoughtful, and humane, a man of reason in an age of revolution. Few, however, knew that beneath that measured composure lay a heart forever divided between two worlds, the Belgium he had built and the England he had lost. To the public, he was the father of a nation. In private, he was still the widower of a princess who never became queen as the years had passed. The correspondence between Leopold and Victoria had grown less frequent, but no less tender. Their letters now carried the weight of memory, not instruction. When the Belgian courier brought one such letter that winter, Leopold smiled faintly at the handwriting he knew so well, delicate, precise, and streaked with time. "My dearest uncle," it began, "I think often of those days when the world was young for both of us, and how strange it is that so much began with so much loss." She spoke of her children, of her grief for Albert that still haunted her every waking hour, and of her constant sense that the living and the dead were never truly separated, only veiled from one another. "Sometimes," she wrote, "when I walk in the gardens at dusk, I feel her near me, Charlotte, as though she watches us both still, through you and through me, through all that has come since." Leopold folded the letter carefully, pressing his fingertips to the wax seal before placing it beside the portrait. His breathing had grown shallow these past weeks, his physicians murmuring about a failing heart. He knew the truth without their words. He was nearing the end. There was no fear in him, only a sense of completion, as though he were finally approaching a threshold he had seen in dreams for years. He had built a kingdom, guided a queen, and lived long enough to see the child of his lost love's bloodline rule an empire. What remained now was the quiet reckoning of memory. He asked to be left alone that evening, and when the attendants withdrew, the great clock struck 10. The wind outside had turned colder still, rattling the shutters like the faint tapping of distant hands. Leopold rose slowly, each movement deliberate, and walked toward the small cabinet where he kept his private relics. From within he drew a folded piece of paper, the letter Charlotte had written him during her pregnancy, days before her death. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. "My dearest husband, if I am ever taken from you, remember that I was happiest by your side. Whatever comes, promise me you will not close your heart to life." He read it again, lips trembling, and then placed it gently back beside her portrait. "I tried," he said softly. "Oh, my love, I tried." The fire crackled low. The old king lowered himself into the chair once more and gazed into the flames. And for a moment, time seemed to loosen its grip. He saw her, not as memory, not as illusion, but as vividly as the day she had walked through the gardens at Claremont, her laughter ringing through the morning air. She turned toward him, eyes alive, and smiled that familiar, gentle smile. "Leopold," she said, and though no sound passed her lips, he felt the word resonate in his chest. He reached out, not in desperation but in peace, and as the last flame guttered and fell into darkness, the king's head bowed forward, his hand resting on the portrait, his lips curved in the faintest of smiles. When his servants found him at dawn, the candle still burned beside the portrait. The city mourned him deeply, draping black over every window, tolling the bells as they had once tolled in England for his bride. Victoria wept openly when she received the news, writing in her journal, "My beloved Uncle Leopold, the truest friend, the gentlest soul, the last of my childhood's guardians, has gone. He was to me as a father, and yet I know in my heart that his spirit returns now to hers. They are together at last. At his funeral, the chapel was filled with a soft scent of roses, white Charlotte's favorite. The choir sang low hymns as the coffin, draped in the Belgian flag, was carried beneath the high arches. In one quiet moment before the service began, Victoria herself approached the bier, her black veil trembling with each breath. She placed a small silver locket on the coffin inside, a miniature of Charlotte that Leopold had once given her as a child. "For you both," she whispered, her voice breaking, "for all you gave the world, and all the world never knew." The people who watched said that a shaft of sunlight pierced through the grey clouds, then, falling directly across the coffin, lighting it with a glow that lingered impossibly long before fading. Some swore they heard the faint sound of bells, not Belgian, but English, as though the two kingdoms, once divided by sea and sorrow, had found harmony at last after his death. Victoria ordered a memorial built at Windsor, near the spot where Charlotte had been buried. It bore a simple inscription, in memory of King Leopold I of Belgium, beloved uncle and faithful guardian to Her Majesty Queen Victoria, and devoted husband to Princess Charlotte of Wales. Beneath it, she added her own words, "Love is not ended by death, but fulfilled by it." Years later, when Victoria herself grew old and frail, she often spoke of the two of them as if they were the twin stars by which her own life had been guided. "Everything that I am," she told her daughter Beatrice near the end, "came from them, from his wisdom and her spirit. England was meant for her, but fate gave it to me, and I have tried to honor her with every breath." When she finally died in 1901, the attendants who prepared her body discovered that she had requested to be buried, not only with Albert's dressing gown in her arms, but also with Charlotte's portrait placed over her heart, and so the circle that had begun in tragedy closed in tenderness. Two women, one lost too soon, one who lived too long, bound by blood, destiny, and the love of a man who had bridged them both. The empire that had risen in the wake of Charlotte's death would become the largest the world had ever known. And yet, at its center, at the quiet heart of all its grandeur, there remained this single story of youth, of loss, of devotion unbroken by the cruelty of time. In the centuries since, historians have written of Charlotte as a footnote, a promise unfulfilled, a queen who never was. But perhaps they misunderstand, for while her reign never came to pass, her legacy reigned for generations, through Victoria's moral strength, through Leopold's wise statesmanship, through the lineage that followed. Every monument raised in the Victorian age, every reform born of conscience, every symbol of steadfast love between sovereign and people carried, unseen, the echo of her name. She was the seed buried too soon, from which an empire grew, and even now, when the wind sweeps through the graveyard at Windsor and rustles the ivy along her tomb, one might almost imagine a whisper in the night air, not of mourning, but of peace, a voice saying softly, "I am not forgotten. I am where I was always meant to be, not on the throne, but in the hearts of those who remembered." Perhaps that is how history heals itself, not by erasing its tragedies, but by folding them into the fabric of its triumphs, so that the pain of the past becomes the grace of the future. Charlotte of Wales never wore the crown, but through her, the crown learned what it meant to love, to grieve, and to endure.